So we're going to carry on with part 2 and dive a bit more into the details at the other service to the farm and dive into the service applications themselves. And Gary's going to do a similar thing where we'll run the script, and whilst it's running, we'll walk through the individual elements of it, some of the gotchas. We'll look at some of the inconsistencies with the various commandlets for the service applications as well.
At the end, I've got 3 scripts that basically provision individual service applications. Depending on how much time we've got, where things are at, I'll try to get through all 3. But the point was just to show some of the differences and how some of these scripts vary and whatnot. But the main thing I want to show is at least one of them so you can see what a general pattern looks like. If I can show all 3, great. We'll just see how we're doing with time.
And we're deliberately going to skip 2 of the service applications. I mean, the script will be configuring them, but we're going to skip over the details of both the user profile service application and the search service application. So the search one will be covered in depth by Neil in a later module, and we'll talk through the user profile creation later this afternoon in the user profile session. So that's why those are deliberately going to be kind of skimmed over in this session.
So in terms of script and approach, this is a similar slide that I had in the previous session. So is there anybody here who was not in the previous session? Okay. So what I'm doing basically is we built SPO3, so that was done in the first session. Some of our service applications have already been created and service instances provisioned on that server, but we're not going to talk about those until now, actually. So we've got 6 servers on our SharePoint farm. We've done one of them. I'm only showing 1 and 2 here because I didn't want to have too many things listed. But now I'm going to go ahead and build the remaining 5. In a production environment, whatever, when I'm doing this, typically, I don't usually do this using remote. And usually I go ahead and just log into each server and run my scripts one at a time. That way I can kind of baby it, make sure everything's going right. But these servers take roughly about 5 minutes each for us to do what we need to on each one. And during our demo here, I don't want to be constantly toggling back and forth and kicking off the next script. So what I chose to do here was actually use remoting. So 2 benefits from that. I don't have to keep toggling back and forth. And also it gives you a chance to see that this does in fact work using remoting. So I can go ahead and from a single machine provision all the remaining SharePoint servers in my farm. As I mentioned in the previous talk, user profile service, I can actually provision it using remoting, but it's a pain and it would require me to rework my scripts in such a way that it's totally not worth the effort. So that's the only service that just kind of messes things up. And Spence will talk loads about that in later sessions and why it messes all kinds of things up. But the general structure applies. So I've got 1 controller script that I'm going to run on our client machine, which we call Client 01. And all it does is kick off remote sessions and run the same controller script that it ran on SPO3. That guy then loads several other scripts, which are driven by XML. So in terms of what's happening on the machine, it's no different than what we did on SPO3. It's actually the same script, but based on the parameters that I'm passing in and the server that I'm running on, it's going to make different decisions about what to do. And those decisions are driven via primarily via the XML file. So. All right, so we're going to go ahead and hit the big red button, sort of, and fire this guy off. So this is my, so I'm logged into Client 01 right now, and this is my controller script for that, and I called it, cleverly enough, just go. And what I'm doing here is I'm grabbing an array of the servers that I want to run this guy on here, so SPO 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6. I'm going to prompt for the credentials that I want to use to log into those servers. So I'm going to see a little dialog where I got to type in my password. And then I'm just going to loop through each server, and I'm outputting some information here so I know, which server I'm currently working on and how long it's running for. I'm going to create a new PS session object. So this is how basically I'm connecting using remote into these other servers. So I create a new session, pass it the computer name. With remoting, I have to use cred SSP. This is what enables my credentials to be passed back into remote things such as the database. So it's, in concept, cred SSP is kind of like Kerberos. It basically gets around a double hop issue. from a technology standpoint, it's nothing like Kerberos, but it is basically what is allowing my credentials to be passed back into things like SQL Server so that I can be authenticated properly and whatnot. And then I'm also passing in a configuration name here called SharePoint. So with remote in, most of the examples that are out there, people connect using the standard out-of-the-box configuration, which requires that you're a local administrator. I don't ever do that. I create a new configuration. So I actually have commented out here. You can see this command here, register PS session configuration. This allows me to create a new configuration object on my servers. I can name it whatever I want. I called it SharePoint. And in this case, I'm passing in a startup script, so the startup script parameter here. And that startup script is the same one that the SharePoint management shell runs. So this is going to make sure that the snap-in is loaded. And normally it would do my thread-in model, but it doesn't. I have to set that explicitly here, my thread options here. So this is a big one a lot of people also miss with remote in, is their thread options are not set properly. So if you're doing any kind of reporting, you're getting memory leaks most likely. So this is another important one. And I do have in my book a whole chapter that talks about remote in. So if you want to learn kind of ins and outs of that, there's quite a bit of detail in there. And you can also secure that session. So I don't want to have local administrators remote it in. I want to be able to create a specific group of users, for instance, that are allowed to remote in. I shouldn't have to be a local admin to do that, because that's way too much permissions most of the time. In this case, I have to be a local admin because I'm building the farm. So, all right, so once I've got that, I'm going to go ahead and set my execution policy. In this case, I'm going to load my scripts from a network share. I want to avoid any kind of issues there. So for the current process, I'm going to set the execution policy to bypass. This basically just disables everything. So unrestricted is not enough. And then I'm going to go ahead and load, or rather here I've just set them the path to that folder on that network share. And then I'm going to load using .source that same configure server PS1 script that I showed in the previous session, except this time I'm going to pass in a connect parameter. And here I just have a little variable that I created so that I could test the remoting capabilities without actually running the command. So if I set this guy to false, it would enable me to make sure that I can connect to the server but don't actually build the farm. And then once I'm done, I remove the session. So I'm going to go ahead and push the button. So it's prompted me for my credentials, and assuming I typed them right. All right. So now it's going ahead, and I'm seeing the actual output from the individual servers. So whatever is going to be outputted to the console, just as though I were actually on the server running that, I can see that here. And just like in the on SPO3, I had that line to psconfig to make sure we get around that issue. That's this output that you're seeing right now. But the important part is this right here. So it is going ahead and actually connecting to that farm. So while that's running, we'll switch back to the deck.
Okay, so a few more details on our architecture. Obviously, again, we are not able to, it's not intended that you can read this, but we have expanded out our service applications, which Gary will get to the demonstration, or the scripts that create these. This is what we've decided upon after, quite frankly, about half a dozen iterations. We didn't design this perfectly up front first time. We had to go through a number of iterations with the other people presenting this week to figure out what was necessary for each of their different sessions. So the key thing really is that we're using a shared application pool. So the gray box represents an application pool. We've named that SP Services, and that's going to host every one of our application pool, our service application endpoints, which is the green boxes. So we're using one for everything. So BDC, MMS, user profile, search, and so on. Now, there will be cases where we use different service account identities for search and user profiles. But as far as the endpoints, the application pools, we'll just use one. So we made a decision there that we don't have any security isolation requirements that drive us to having them all in different application pools, or separating out a few of them into separate app pools. So this is very much a recommended best practice, if you like, for performance reasons, if we don't have any isolation requirements, to share all of these in a single app pool. And again, the service applications we have are BDC, Managed Metadata Services, Search, User Profiles, and Word Automation. So those are the key functional ones. And then we're also going to deploy the Office web applications. So that's just Excel, Word, and PowerPoint on this diagram. And then, of course, we have the state and usage applications, which aren't really real service applications. They're kind of almost service applications. They just show up in that screen in Central Admin. And web analytics. So web analytics, we require that for the search module. So in order to be able to retrieve search query reports, for example, we need web analytics. And usage, again, is a prerequisite for the search service application and useful to us in general. And of course, state we need for publishing workflows, which we were led to believe would be used as part of the developer solution. So this is why we got to this. Predominantly, our key requirements for the other content around the IT Pro track, so scaling out search, doing the user profile session and so on, but also the requirements from the developers whose application we're going to have to deploy into this environment at some point on Wednesday, assuming they get it finished and so on in time. Now, in terms of the servers that we chose these 6 servers that we saw in the previous session. We really only need 4. So we could do a highly available farm with 6 machines, right? 2 SQL servers, 2 SharePoint application servers, and 2 SharePoint web servers. And that gives us the bare minimum we need to have a highly available farm. But we've gone for 6 because we wanted to be able to show how to do search, scale out, across more than those 4 machines effectively, for performance reasons. So Ben and Steve will talk you through the capacity management sessions later in the week. We'll show the impact of having them on the 4 machines versus the 6 machines. So that's how we arrived at that physical topology, if you like. Don't know if you guys have got anything to add to this discussion whilst we're waiting for the
Yeah,
scripts.
and as you're building these architectures and scripts, I mean, you're not going to get it right the first time. It's sort of an evolution, right? So oftentimes, I'm at an advantage where I've got tons of scripts and things where I can go in and set up farms pretty quickly, but consider the scenario where you don't have any of these scripts already. How do you decide what scripts you're going to build? How do you even start this process? So typically what I would do, or what I used to do, is would set up sort of a prototype farm, something that's going to be throwaway. Work with my end users, my business users, or whatever, to figure out what it is we're actually going to build. But the assumption is that what we have put together is going to be something that we are going to tear down. It's just there to figure out what the requirements are, to make sure that from a technical standpoint, what we can do and architect lines up with the business user's needs. I then take that, and usually I'll use like my test environment to do that, and these guys may do something different, but typically I'll use a test environment, build that, that's my sort of prototype area, and then from that I'll create a dev environment where I'm going to start building my scripts. So I'll start just a single server case. Can I get my scripts even written? How am I going to take what's in this other environment and translate that into a scripted scenario like we've got here? And then I'll use those scripts as the basis to basically tear down my test environment and rebuild it from there. So again, that initial prototype environment, if I got lots of hardware and everything, I'll keep both running at the same time so I can check them. But most of my clients are kind of budget constrained, so I usually end up having to tear down and rebuild. And then from there, I'll go ahead and build a production environment with those scripts. So in our case here, we had several iterations where we built this environment with the scripts, checked it, Spence validated it, other people validated it, does what we have, what we want to build, and what not work in this environment, yes or no. If it doesn't, then we go back or made changes to the scripts, we did it again. But we had these backups so that we could keep going back and reverting back to this master set and testing these scripts, making sure that things worked right before we got something solid. So now you're seeing scripts that are running that have been through several iterations already before we've actually gotten to this point. So clearly there's a lot of work up front to get there, and there's a lot of discussions and decisions and a lot of things happen in the business track and whatnot before we can even get scripts written. If you try to write scripts from the get-go, you're going to spend time writing scripts that you may not need. I'll show you an example of that. Actually, my my main configure server script, I've got a whole block of code commented out. It's because I actually, for time reasons, had to start creating some scripts and getting things together before we had some decisions made. So there are several service applications that I had accounted for through script that it turned out we didn't need. So don't waste time creating things that you're not going to need, basically.
Yeah, I mean, taking the logical architecture and applying it to the farm topology build out is perhaps, well, it's definitely one of the top 10 infrastructure mistakes made with respect to SharePoint deployments, period. So having an invalid topology, for lack of a better term. And that's very commonly driven by the idea to, that needs to be in place and ready before anything else can come along. So there's pressure to do it. It's usually done way too early in the project. And if it's, again, as Gary said, if you're doing it if you're automating it via scripting, it's too easy to get carried away and build the one script that rules them all, has everything in it, which will, inevitably need pruning later on as you actually refine this. It's not just, coming up with this is actually the easy part, right? The figuring out what web applications you need, what service apps you need, but then actually deploying the service instances into the farm is the real problem area, because it's too easy to make a small mistake and not have the service instances on enough machines in the farm, accidentally put them on the wrong machine in the farm, which happens over and over again. These kind of things, whilst they might seem like a small deal, we see them over and over again when we do production environment health checks, where it's a simple switch that's missing. So you've really got to get into the habit of, as Gary mentioned in the earlier session, treating these scripts as if they're production code, because that's what they are. It's too dangerous to pick snippets off the internet and run them or combine them together yourself. And then that ideal of having an automation solution is kind of out of the window. Then you're really into a world of you're just doing the same thing you would do in central admin via a console, but you're not actually getting the benefits of the idea of automation there. So it's very important to fully understand, first of all, what SharePoint can do in terms of service instances, what machines they need to be on, how they communicate, but also be heavily invested in making sure that your automation code is robust, solid, tested, gone through plenty of iterations. And it's easy to do, right? We can easily do it on a standard class laptop before we ever need to run those scripts against real environments.
And I think a key point Spence made as far as downloading and running code. So my book, I think I showed it earlier, right? So tons of examples. There's code that you can download with that that allows you to build service applications, web applications. A lot of what I'm showing, you can download that, tweak it, change it, whatever. There's Coplex projects, there's blog posts, all that. Please don't just download the code, whether it's from my book or anything else, and just run it. Make sure you understand what it's doing. There's some stuff out there that's not valid. An example of an old post I had written that people still rely on, it was written during beta for provision in the search service. It's wrong. The code that's in there is for beta, and it represented my understanding of the product at that time. Now, the updated version that comes with the book is much better, but you need to understand who wrote this code, when was it written, what is their environment, their scenario. There's going to be some decisions that people may have made with their scripts that don't apply. They either missed something or did something that just isn't relevant for your environment, or will put you in a configuration state that just doesn't apply to you, or is flat out wrong and will cause you issues later. So just be real careful about downloading scripts. Make sure that you understand what they're doing. Walk through it. This is why I'm trying to kind of show you some key points as we're walking through the scripts here, just some things to think about. So there's too much code, there's too many things, too many services for me to walk through every aspect of every script to provision everything we're doing here. But the point is for you to go do that and take that time to understand what it is that you're executing on your environment. Because like I said, there are some things out there that do some pretty dumb things.
Yeah, it's a very good point, because the vast majority of the scripts that are out there, community scripts and so on, are generally done for one of two purposes. They're either done for a given project and then they're published for whatever reason, shared, or they're there to explain certain capabilities. And as we've already touched on, there's a lot of inconsistencies in the SharePoint PowerShell commandlets and in other aspects of PowerShell as well. We have to remember this is actually quite a new thing, right? We might have everybody in the room might have been doing PowerShell for SharePoint for a couple of years, but in the grand scheme of things, that's quite new. And there's a lot of things out there that have been done because the author couldn't get it to work any other way, for example, and they've hit a problem, and they've fought that problem for a while, and then they've come up with a workaround that worked for them, but is not appropriate for repeatable deployment. And so you've got to, as Gary said, the more you understand what it's doing, both in terms of the commandlets, their eccentricities, but also PowerShell techniques, like some of the ones that Gary's shown you in the earlier session around splunking and so forth. That knowledge will greatly enhance your ability to pick and choose the right things you find that are out there. But yeah, it's paramount you understand what they're doing. I'll give you a tangible example of one script which changes the permissions of a user on the machine, on the server. And so once those permissions are changed, for that permission change to take effect, the user has to log off and log back on again. But the script will actually only perform the task that simulates that in one condition state. And so if a service is running, it will restart that service. If the service isn't running, it won't restart it. And in that case, the following tasks will fail. And that's an example of the sort of conditional logic that's in the automation engine script that can basically take away the entire benefits of using PowerShell in the first place. So it's key that you understand the commandlets themselves, but also the order of execution. The simpler you can keep the automation code, the better, as a general statement. Because you don't want to be wading through, script A to script Z and not, losing where you are. And then, the actual 2 lines that are calling the PowerShell commandlet that are actually doing the work is lost in all of the surrounding infrastructure, if you like.
Right. And a lot of my code, you'll see, is more complex. There are a lot more surrounding code. Partly because of my role as a consultant, I'm going into environments where the requirements change. So these are scripts that I did not just come up with one day. These scripts have evolved since the beta product, so several years worth of work and understanding and whatnot. A lot of that knowledge and benefit, I've tried to encapsulate in the book. But even then, I'm limited to 800 pages for the book. So, and actually 50 of that they had to pull out because it was too many. So, so there's so many things to consider and whatnot. But I try to deal with as many generic cases as I can within whatever time constraints that I have, whether it be through pages, my blog posts, or whatever. So, cool. All right, so let's talk about actually provisioning these service applications. There's a general pattern that you're going to follow, certain things you need to think about. If you're doing it through central admin, you tend to forget some of this stuff because a lot of it is abstracted for you. If you're doing it through using the configuration wizard, the farm configuration wizard, well, stop, don't use it. You shouldn't be ever using that, so I won't say any more about it. If you're just going through central admin, you're either going to manually start the service instance on one or more servers, and then you're going to create the service application. And on that, it's going to prompt you for an application pool and whatnot, but it's not going to talk about proxies. It's either going to create it for you manually if it needs it, or it won't. Actually, I think all of them have one, maybe. But when we're doing it through PowerShell, we've got to deal with all these things individually. So the service instance, what server am I going to start that on? So actually, that was pretty much a one-to-one with the central admin. But now the application pool. I talked about this a little bit in the previous session, but am I going to use an existing application pool? Am I going to create a new one? To me, it's actually more straightforward with the service applications because I have explicit commandlets for dealing with that. I have a get SP service application pool. I have a new SP service application pool commandlet that I can work with. Now I'm going to go ahead and create the service application. I'm going to pass that pool object with it. And then the service application proxy, maybe. It may have been created for me, it may not have been. And this is going to vary based on the service application itself. There's several different inconsistencies there around the proxy, and that's where it starts getting kind of confusing. So when do I need to create one? When do I don't? When do I have one that meets my needs? When do I need to delete and create a new one? That kind of stuff. And then from there, any additional permissions that you may need to grant. Now, whether it's granting the service application account permissions to content databases, or granting some other account permissions to the service application. So maybe you need to grant users permissions to manage user profiles or something like that. Okay, so proxies. Proxies are a mess. So it's extremely inconsistent in terms of the commandlets, how you work with them. Some commandlets have or some service applications have a commandlet that allows me to specifically retrieve its proxy. So get SP something service application proxy, metadata service application proxy. Most of them don't. Some of them allow me to explicitly create the proxy. Some don't. Some of them, I have no choice. I have to create it manually. Some of them, it's automatically created when I create the service application. Some of them give me the ability to delete the proxy, but not the ability to create a proxy. So it gets really kind of messy. In terms of service instances, sharing, partitioning, all of them but one have a service instance that you need to create. They start somewhere, basically. Sharing, so this is sharing across farms. Some of them allow you to be, some proxies can be, or service applications can be shared across farms, and depending on the decision you're making there will dictate how you're going to create that proxy. And then partitioning options. Again, this is another one that's inconsistent. So some of them, so if I got multi-tenant scenarios, some of them I can set my partitioning option when I create the service application, and that'll just trickle to the proxy. I don't have to do anything else. Some of them, I've got to set it when I create the application and the proxy, and the values have to match. I don't really understand why I have to set it in two places. I should be able to just, if I create the application partition, then the proxy should know it, but you got to set them in both places. So, but it's not consistent in how those attributes are, or parameters rather, are utilized. So here's just a quick table that I put together that just kind of details some of those inconsistencies here. So all the service applications that we're using are listed here. There's a couple others that we're not using that I've included as well. So you can see in terms of the service instance, all of them but the state service have an actual service instance that you would start. Some of these have a Windows service, one or more Windows services that are actually associated with those service instance. I don't know if you want to explain maybe the differences between a service instance versus a Windows service.
Yeah, so if we're talking about a service instance, we're effectively talking about what's in services on server in central admin. So that's a SharePoint service instance. And that is effectively a wrapper for the functional components that actually perform tasks. And some of those may be a Windows service, like user profile sync or claims to Windows token service, or the search crawler. But many of them, and most of them in fact, are just .NET assemblies on the machine. So something like Secure Store, there's no Windows service associated with it, but there is a SharePoint service instance that is some .NET assemblies and web services which need to be running. And when we click Start in services on server, or we provision the service instance via PowerShell, that's what we're actually deploying.
Now, when it comes to creating the proxy through PowerShell, so if you're doing this through central admin, proxy creation is handled for you. You don't even have to think about it. If it needs it, it creates it. But through PowerShell, you've got to think about it. So, and this is where it gets, again, inconsistent. So with access services, for example, I have no mechanism to explicitly create that proxy. When I create the service application, it'll automatically create the proxy for me. I'm good to go. But if you delete the proxy through central admin, if somebody comes in and for whatever reason they delete that proxy, there's no way for me to recreate just the proxy. I actually have to delete the service application in its entirety and recreate it. Fortunately for access services, it's mostly just configuration data. You're not going to lose any data if you actually delete that service application. You just have to reset all your configurations. And that's going to be the case with most of these, where you can find yourself in that scenario and actually Excel and usage service. Deleting the service application, you're not going to lose anything as long as you don't delete the databases associated with it. So,
yeah, and this table is a good example of what we were talking about earlier, where there's a lot of confusion around this, and so it's actually taken quite a while before the general field has come to understand this state, what's described in this table. And so there are lots of scripts out there that don't take this stuff into account and attempt to use a generic model which of course, as you can see, with lots of no's and yeses on this slide, is not really appropriate. We need to understand the devil in the detail here in order to, build out individual scriptlets, if you like, for each service instance. Another thing to watch out for as well is if you're unfortunately in the world where you have to combine sharing service applications that are partitioned, it gets even more complicated, and that's a whole nother scenario where you have to understand which ones support which in terms, and whether they work or not. So an example would be the secure store proxy cannot be published, if it's published, cannot be created in partition mode, but it doesn't actually matter. It'll just work fine without the parameter, and then with a different service application that won't be the case. So this is extremely important stuff to be familiar with when building these kind of automation scripts.
Right, a couple other quick examples. So business connectivity services I have there is optional. What that means is it's going to create the proxy for you automatically, but if I delete it, I can't explicitly go ahead and recreate that proxy. The reason that I have that ability to create the proxy is because it's shared. So the intention of the ones that, so you'll see the ones that are shared, for the most part, I can create the proxy through PowerShell. That's all because if I'm going to share it, if I'm going to consume it, I'm a consumer, I need to be able to just create that proxy to point to my publisher, my actual service application. So in the case of BCS, the whole reason the create piece is there is all about being a consumer in a shared environment. Otherwise, you don't need to worry about the proxy creation, let it just create it for you. And then some of these, as far as other options here, like the claims to Windows token service, it doesn't really apply. You start the service, there is no service application, no real service application, right? It's just the service instance. All right, now in terms of the service instance and how to get that started and whatnot, there's three key commandments: get SP service instance, start SP service instance, and stop SP service instance. Pretty self-explanatory. So the one sort of thing to think about with the start is that you may want to block your script execution until that guy actually completes. Most of the services, it's not a big deal. Start it, move on, doesn't matter. Some of them, can't remember off the top of my head which one specifically now, if that service instance isn't started, it'll actually balk if you try to create the service application afterwards and it's not running. So I always go ahead, and technically it's not supposed to even matter what order you do it. I should be able to create that service instance afterwards, but there is at least one case where it failed on me if I tried to do it that way. So point being, I typically will start my service instance first, and then I don't have to worry about it, and then I put a little bit of code in there to say block script execution until that guy is actually finished running. And we can see that here. So this is basically a little helper function that I put together to deal with this. So I can pass in what is the type name, the name of my service instance that I want to start, and then whether I want to enable it or stop it, basically. So I got a little bit of error handling code there. If it's null, then just go ahead and bug out line 5. But the line 2, the first highlighted instance, is I'm taking that string type name that was provided to me and trying to get that service instance. Key point here is the server that I'm running on. So if I got a farm that's already provisioned and I'm just starting something, I can run this from any server and just pass in the name of whatever server I'm considering. In my case, because I'm building a farm, I'm considering one server at a time. I always want the current server. So I'm using an environment variable called computer name. So $env is called an automatic variable. It's already there for me as part of PowerShell. I don't have to do anything to get that. So $env : computer name gives me the name of my current server. So by passing that into the get SP service instance commandlet, I can get just the service instance that's specific to the current server that I'm working on. This is another thing a lot of scripts that are out there don't take into account, is the fact that I might have more than one server in my farm. Many of them are meant for building dev environments, single server instances. So they don't often account for the fact that if I don't provide server name there and I have a where there, I'm getting an array back, not a single server instance. So once I had that, I go check the status. So is it the status of my server? If it's not online and I passed in true to enable it, I'm going to go ahead and start it. So I'm basically just going to pipe that service instance into my start SP service instance commandlet, and then I block. So I have a simple little while block. I'm just going to say, while the status is not equal online, sleep for 2 seconds. And then after that sleep, I just re-retrieve it. Technically, I don't need that re-retrieve. It actually will update that variable for me, but it's safer to do that. And then I exit out. Otherwise, if I'm online and I'm saying turn it off, then basically the same thing, except now I'm doing stop SP service instance. And then here, dash confirm false. I don't want to get prompted to stop it. So with start, you're not going to get prompted. With stop, you will. So here, I know in an automation scenario, I don't want all these different props coming up to ask me if I want to actually do this. So by passing in false to that switch parameter, I ignore that prompt. And then again, I block. So in terms of creating the service application pool, again, so I talked about earlier, we've got some commandlets that we can actually work with here. So get SP service application pool. It's going to retrieve all of our existing application pools. If I'm creating a new one, I need to be able to get and create a managed account in order to pass into the new SP service application pool. So get SP managed account, new SP managed account. The trick here is make sure that you're not using an account that shouldn't be a managed account. So don't use your farm account, which is not the best example, but it is a farm account because of user profile service. Dang.
There's always one.
Yeah. Another example, I had an environment, somebody used the same account for everything. So tracing, web accounts, web application pool accounts, service application pool accounts, cache profiles, all that kind of stuff. And you go and set it up as a managed account and set your password expiration options in there so it automatically changes the password and then everything breaks. Right? So there's a separate, I look at it as there's service accounts and there's managed accounts, and you got to be careful about making sure you're not using the same account for both. I don't know if there's a better example there. I'm drawing a blank right now. But.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very common to use one account for both the services and the web applications. Kind of what we spoke about earlier. That's going to cause multiple performance problems in the farm. You generally want to. I mean, we're sharing a service application pool account here for all the endpoints. And it's very important to make a clear distinction between these, or this one in our example, and the accounts that are used for Windows services like search and user profile, etc. And that's, again, a performance and manageability recommendation. It's not necessarily a security recommendation.
So another example would be tracing, right? So we have an account called SP Services that we're using for all of our application pool accounts here. We're also setting a domain account for the trace service, and we set that to SP Trace. If I had used the SP Services account for that, so if somebody is looking at this and saying, well, it's a service, let's use that account for it, but I'd set up SP Services as a managed account with password change options in there, so it automatically changes, so SharePoint manages that password. Now my tracing is broken once that password changes. I have to go and manually change that password, but SharePoint's managing the password, so what do I change the password to? You don't know. So the point is, again, that there's service accounts and there's managed service accounts, and make sure that they don't overlap. So, cool. All right. So here's just another helper function that I created to go ahead and either retrieve an existing application pool for me, or if one doesn't exist, go ahead and create it. So again, I'm passing in the pool name that I want. So in our case, it's going to be SharePoint Services Pool, I think is what we called it. The identity, so for us it'll be ISC London /SP Services. That's going to be our account for that pool, and then our password. Key lines are highlighted here, and the rest is all just basically setting up for the line on number 20. So first I'm going to go ahead and get my service application pool. Don't error out if it doesn't exist. If I have a pool, if I get back a non-null value, I'm going to jump right down to 22 and just return that back. I'm good to go. Otherwise, I need to create that pool account. So all of this code is all about just getting that SP managed account set up so that I can go ahead on line 20 and actually call a new SP service application pool and pass that account in. So whether or not I was provided a username and a password and whatnot, I'm either going to prompt for credentials, so line 9, get credential I have an identity there, but I don't have a password. On line 11 and 12, I have an identity and I have a password, so I'm just going to create a new PS credential object manually. I don't need to prompt the user for it. And then I'm going to use that to go ahead and get my managed account. And then if I don't have a managed account, I create one. So what we talked about earlier is you can end up having a lot of code. This is being somewhat generic and dealing with different situations. If you're writing a script and you know you're always going to have, you've kind of created that managed account, created that application pool, it's good to go, you know it's there, well, you can just do that one line and you're good to go. So in terms of creating the service application, so we have our application pool now, so now we're ready to go ahead and create the service application. First, like I talked about earlier, I want to make my scripts resilient. I don't want to call new SP anything unless I first check to see if I've already called new SP anything, and basically check to see that that service application exists or not. This again enables me to rerun my scripts. If I get a failure or anything like that, I can make a change and I can rerun it, and I don't have to worry about it trying to basically erroring out on things that I know have already succeeded. So get SP service application will return back a list of all the service applications. I can then filter that by name if I need to. Or most of the service applications have a specific get commandlet. So get SP something, metadata service application or whatever it may be. So again, make sure it's existing. If you're looking for service application commandlets, you don't know what's available, GCM is an alias for get command. So I can type get command or GCM get-sp star. I can use a wildcard in that SP service application, and it'll return back all the commandlets related to the get SP service application. New, same thing. All the service applications have a new commandlet, obviously. And again, I can do GCM new -sp star service application to retrieve the list of what commandlets are available. All right, so in terms of some sample code here, in this case I just chose the business data catalog, so BCS. It's actually it's called business data connectivity services now, but the commandlet is still business data catalog. So here you can see for my application pool, I'm setting up the name, SharePoint Services App Pool, our identity, our password, the name of the service app. So in this case, it's ICS Business Data Connectivity Service. And then I'm calling that helper function that I showed earlier. So that's line 6. So get service pool. And that's just going to give me an SP service application pool object that I'm then going to use later on. So on line 8, this is where I'm looking for a specific service application that matches the name. So again, resiliency. I want to be able to run this over and over, and if I already created it, just move on to the next one. So I look to see if I've got a service application whose name matches the app name specified on line 4. If I don't have it, then I go ahead and create it. So in this case, again, for the BCS one, it's new SP Business Data Catalog Service Application. And I'm going to pass in my name, my database server, database name, application pool. I wanted to point out the failover database server here just as an example where this is an optional parameter. I can pass in an empty string here and it'll work just fine. But there are some, I think secure store services, if I'm remembering right, is one example, where if I did that, it would error. It would tell you that the failover database parameter is required. You can't do that. And that's where you would either use an if-else block or splatting, like I showed earlier. Or you can call it splunking.
Same thing.
Okay, yeah, and if it does exist, I just write out a nice little message for login purposes. Creating the service application proxy, it's effectively the same kind of pattern, right? Usually, every commandlet, if I got like new SP service, new SP business data catalog service application, the proxy is going to be the same thing with the word proxy at the end, right? And in terms of discovery, it's the same syntax. I can use a get command to find what those commandlets are. So if we look at an example now of how to do that. So in this case, I switched over to the managed metadata service just as a different example. It's a little bit more interesting. So I'm giving it a name, ISC managed metadata service. I'm giving it, I'm checking to see whether that proxy exists first. So get SP metadata service application proxy. Pass in the proxy name. And again, silently continue if I get an error. And same thing, if it is null, so I don't have it, I go ahead and create it. So this one here has a few more options. Most of the proxy creation commandlets, you pass it a name and that's it. There's actually no options there. This is one of the few. I think the Visio one has parameters. Might be one other one that I'm forgetting. But usually it's name and whether it's partitioned or not. And those are typically the only options you'll pass in there. So this is one of the few that has a few more things that you can do there. And you see in this case, for this example at least, I didn't bother showing the fact that these switch statements here, I can do colon and then explicitly true or false. In my scripts I'll show you later, I do that because I don't know how the XML is going to be configured. But in your environment, if you're writing a script, you're always going to want these settings a certain way. Don't necessarily make it that generic. So pull that stuff out of the XML if you're downloading from something. So keep the amount of configurations that I need to think about and change in your XML limited as much as possible so that your script is hard coding some of those defaults. All right, in terms of relevant permissions, I mentioned earlier there's kind of two different things to consider. First off, some of your service applications will require that the service, the account associated with the application pool has permissions to get into your various content databases. Typically, some of the BI ones are the ones that stand out the most, Excel, Visio, whatnot. They'll need access to the content database for the web application in order for them to work properly. So the best way to do that, as opposed to manually hacking the database, which you shouldn't do, is to basically grab the SP web application object that you want. So you can use get SP web application to loop through the web applications, and there's a method on that called grant access to process identity. I'm just going to pass in the string representation of your account name, and that'll basically grant that account DBO rights to that database. In terms of the service application and granted permissions to that, when you go into Central Admin and you have the Manage Service Applications page, you'll see there's an administrator button and a permissions button. It gets confusing. The code is basically the same in terms of how you set those. There is a flag, a Boolean that you're going to set that's going to tell it whether to go here or there. So actually, if we go next, you can see a sample code here. I'll get to that in just actually, let's talk about the bottom one first here. So another helper function, grant service app permission. You're going to pass in a service application, the user, the permission that you want, so full control as an example, and then whether or not it's going to be an admin permission or not. So for that last parameter, if I set true, it's going to be the equivalent of going and hitting that administrator's button. If I set false, it's going to be the equivalent of going and hitting the permissions button. So here, I need to get what's called the getSP service application security object. And that little admin flag is what I was talking about. So true or false tells me which bucket I'm pulling from. Once I have that, I go ahead and create a new claims principal. So I'm going to pass in that user. And in this case, I'm saying these are all basically NT accounts, so Active Directory accounts. And then I'm going to pass my security object, so line 4, into the grant SP object security. So this is sort of the key piece here. So I'm taking that security bucket and my claims principal and the rights that I want, and I'm creating a new SP object security object. So this is basically what defines the permissions that I want to apply. Once I have that, on line 5 now, I actually apply that to the service application. So I get my bucket, get my permission, create a new security description, and then apply that to the service application. And then you can see an example on line 8 and 10 there of how I'm actually calling it. So 8, I'm just getting the service application, and then 10 is where I'm actually calling that function. So going back up to the first example now, in terms of granting access to, so that's granting access to the service application. Now I want to grant access to the content database. I want to grant the access to the service account to the content database. So again, 1 through 3 is just getting the service application and getting my service account. So here on 1, I get the service application. Rather than hard coding that account or trying to pull that back from XML, I just grab the application pool, process account, and name. And that's going to give me, in this case, that ISC London /SP services. And then from there, I'm just looping through all my web applications. So just like in math, I can do scoped operations here. I'm calling that commandlet, get SP web application, wrapping that in parentheses. That'll return back a collection that I can then iterate over on line 5 there. And then I just call the grant access to process identity method. And that's going to go ahead and set those database permissions for me. So do that, don't manually edit the database. All right. So what I wanted to do now, oops, I logged out of this machine, let me log back in. Crap. Sorry guys, I just typed the wrong password. All right, I just wanted to just quickly walk through, oh, come on. There you go. It's all right, I just locked the account there for a second. All right. Good times. All right, I just wanted to really quickly walk through just some of the discovery there, just so you can see what that looks like. So if I want to go ahead and get, for instance, all the service application pools, I can type get SP service application pool. And in this case, our scripts have already run, and they've actually already finished, and the farm's built. But you don't know that yet. So in this case, we just have one that we created, and that's SharePoint services pool. So one thing to point out really quick is if you're looking in IIS, you don't really see an application pool called SharePoint services pool. Right? If we look at the names here, I see some GUIDs. If you're trying to figure out for whatever reason what's what, this keyboard's killing me. I can do a select here, and I can say ID.
So you don't know which one, what that GUID is off the top of your head?
Right. So now if I bring back the ID, the IDs here will correlate with the GUIDs in IIS. So if I look at this guy here, this 58871, that's this one here, right? So if you're ever trying to figure out, what account is associated with this, that's one way to do that. But, usually it's more about if you're bringing that service app back for any reason, you want to see what's there. But the main thing I wanted to show is more on the discovery side. So if I do GCM, so this is short for get command, get dash command, I can say get SP, service application. And this will bring back a list of just the commandlets specific to retrieving a service application. Likewise, if I change this to new, this will get me all the new ones, right, for creating a service application. And if you are having trouble seeing the name there, just do a select. You can see just the name. The other thing I want to point out is sometimes with these commandlets, particularly when you're working with new releases, the help documentation does not actually line up with what the parameters actually can take. The commandlet can actually take in terms of parameters. So for instance, if I do help new, we'll just take the first one here, access service application. I can see the syntax here, what parameters are available. Sometimes this help documentation isn't accurate. Either it's missing parameters or there's parameters that it defines that aren't actually there. It's gotten better as updates have come out and whatnot, but as we're talking about down the road, with the next version of SharePoint coming out at some point, as you're starting to play with scripts and whatnot, the help documentation is going to be pretty bad. So one thing I tend to do is if you use GCM again and new SP access, and then put syntax on the end of that. This will use reflection to actually look at the commandlet and the parameters that are available. So you're seeing the actual parameters that the commandlet can take versus what is in the help documentation. So you don't get any description for these, but you'll often discover parameters that are available, this is more the case right now, parameters that are available that are not actually documented. Especially as service packs come out and whatnot in additional updates, they've been adding parameters, but they haven't been updating their documentation. Okay.
Okay. Let's do one. And then.
Okay. All right, so what I want to do now is just kind of walk through one of the sample scripts that I've got here. So we're running towards the end here, so I'm not going to be able to get through them all. So I wanted to just show you the BCS script and how I'm provisioning that. So in terms of the general pattern, we're going to start the Business Data Connectivity Service instance. So Business Data Connectivity Service is the type name for that service instance. We're going to retrieve the application pool, create it if it doesn't exist, but we're just going to use that little helper method that I showed earlier. Create the service application. Our proxy is automatically created, so we don't need to create that. Although in my script, you'll see where I do have the provisions to create it if necessary. And then I'm going to set the proxy group memberships. So this is all about your associations with your web applications. So when you go through central admin, I can say this service application is associated with this web application, this one with this web application. The way I've set my scripts up is I can define that through XML, and I can go ahead and set that each time. So if I have multiple proxy groups, I can set that membership up, and my scripts will generally do that all the time. So they'll usually not add you to the default association automatically, which is the default behavior, and I go and manually do that. This is more edge case. Most people are going to be just assigning using the default memberships. So I have it there, the script's available, and I detail it in the book, but it's not something that's going to be used very often by most people. So let's actually look at that script here. So you see I've got, folder for every single service application here, and actually if we look at the configure script, let me show you something really quick. So this is, again, the configure server script that I showed earlier. And you can see where I'm loading the scripts and then executing that particular function. So the BCS one is somewhere up here. There we go. So it's going to load that script and then call start BCS service and pass in the XML file. One thing I just wanted to point out is you see I've got all these other services that are commented out here. This is what I was talking about earlier as far as jumping ahead and starting to create scripts before you have your architecture defined. In our case, we were doing some things in parallel, so I kind of had no choice here. I didn't know what services I needed to create, so I started getting these scripts ready for the event that they were going to be needed. So a lot of time was spent by me getting these scripts prepped in the event that we were going to need them because we hadn't defined those architectures yet. So it basically just comes back to the importance of figuring out what you need to build before you start wasting time creating scripts that aren't going to be necessary. In my case, I had the benefit that these scripts were already created. I just had to kind of fine-tune them and get them in a potential demo state. So let's look at the BCS one now. So if we take a look at that XML real quick and the script. So again, the XML. So it's very similar to what we saw earlier, except here I'm going to define my BCS service sort of category, if you will. What service do I want to start the service instance on? So in this case, we're going to run that service instance on just 3 and 4, so not on the web front ends. And then I can have multiple service applications defined within this XML if I want. But I give it my name, database server, whether it's shared or partitioned, the application pool that I want to use, and then my proxy group membership. So in our case, this for all of our XMLs are going to be default. We're just adding to the default group, so we only have the one. And, oops. All right, so let's just talk about that script again. So in terms of the general structure of the script, they all follow the same pattern in the sense that they take in a settings file. It's mandatory, position 0, can't be null or empty. This is just going to be the path to an XML file. I'm then going to go ahead and load that file as an XML document. And then I have a little check here to determine whether or not I should even be installing it on the server. So should I be activating the instance on the server? If I shouldn't be, so if that server element here, so let's say I'm running on SPO1, it's not listed there, it's actually going to bug out. So it's looking, do I have an element in that server's node that matches my current computer name? You can see that if I scroll over. And if I don't, then go ahead and just return. Don't even bother creating the service application or anything. I'm only going to bother with the stuff if I'm on a server where I even need to think about it. Because I could have an empty element there, or I could have servers defined that I haven't even added to the farm yet. So don't bother creating the service application if I haven't determined yet whether or not I'm even going to have an instance. Because a service application without an instance is basically nothing. I then go ahead and get the service instance here. So get SP service instance. Now I could have called that little utility method that I had created. In this case, I just kind of extracted it out into a smaller little bit here just to go ahead and get that instance and start it. So you can see the type name here is Business Data Connectivity Service. So I would have loved it if they added an attribute on here where I could specify the type name. But instead, I had to return back all the instances and then filter through them after the fact. Kind of inefficient, but I guess it works. And then I go ahead and start it. And in this case, again, I'm not bothering with blocking. So in terms of resiliency, I would have been better off here calling that helper function that I showed you guys earlier. But I just wanted to show just a simplified version of something that at least works. Now I'm going ahead and looping through my that BCS service applications element for every service application that I've defined. In our case, we've only got one of each service application, so this loop, it's the same pattern in all my files, but it's only ever going to create one service application. And this is the same code that I showed earlier as far as creating my application pool. Actually, it's calling that helper method I showed earlier, rather. And now again, I check to see if the service application exists. If it doesn't, I create it. And then in this case, my pool already exists. I don't need to do anything more. I can stop. So I'm going to go ahead and not do anything. The reason I'm retrieving the proxy here is so that I can set the proxy group memberships. So I think, let's see. I didn't do it on this one. So I have a helper method down here, and I'm not going to get into too much detail on this because it's kind of confusing. But basically, I had the ability to go ahead and get the list of groups that you want to add this service application to. I go ahead and remove things, determine whether or not it's already in there, and add them in and all that kind of stuff. So this code is kind of confusing, but again, I detail it in the book. But it's basically the bulk of the code is just figuring out, have I already added this guy to the group, that proxy group? If I have, then don't do anything. Otherwise, go ahead and add them. If I'm removing them, then remove them. So there's just a lot of code there to figure out, what it is you're trying to do based on the current state. But the key pieces here really are this remove. So if I need to pull them from a member, you're just going to pass in the, let's see, there's this commandlet here I should point out first. So this gets me the list of all the proxy groups. And I just loop through that, and I'm either going to remove them or I'm going to add them. And if I need to, I'll create a new one. So those are the key commandments for that. But again, this is kind of edge case, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. The main point is just the creation of the service application. So BCS is a pretty simple one. There's not a whole lot to do. You get the core service instance, your application, your proxy, and that's about it. You start getting into things like user profile service and search, and now this script which I have here, which a lot of it is, there's some comments, there's some new line characters, some little helper functions which most people wouldn't have. You're looking at realistically, less than 80 lines of code, and you could shrink that down probably to about 10, or less even. Search, my script is somewhere around 300 or 400 lines of code, so it's a nightmare, right? So, do we have time? Do you want to show?
Okay, so let's have a quick look and see what the end result is of the fingers crossed.
Okay, so let's All right, okay, so back on client 01, and this is the PowerShell instance where we ran our script from. And if I tab through here, we can see it's got a bunch of output. See all this red? They go, oh my God, it failed. Yeah, not so much. This is what I was talking about earlier in the earlier session, where with remote in, if you remove the PowerShell snap-in and add it back in, the way the remoted session is set up, it doesn't properly remove the type definitions. So when you add a PowerShell snap-in, it registers some type information about it. And through a normal window, doing a remove properly removes that. Remote in, it just leaves it all there. So when I go to add it back in, I get all this red crap here that I can't get rid of. Putting it in a try-catch block doesn't get rid of it. Doing an error action, silently continue doesn't get rid of it, because it's just basically written to the host. It's not a real error. So it's just written in red, which makes it look bad. So it's a little deceptive. But for the most part, it looks like we didn't get any errors other than those. So let's validate by jumping onto the server here. Oops. Open a different window. All right, so I think I have central admin still open. So let's come into application management and manage service applications. And we now see all of our service applications have been provisioned. We have a nice consistent naming convention for all of those, which is another thing that's really nice. If we come into services on server, so I'm currently on SP03, and if we look, we can see the services that we wanted started are started. So for instance, these are stopped, right? But if I switch over to a different server here, let's say our web front end. So first off, we can also see that all of our servers are listed here. So this is our SQL Server alias that we've used. This is our outgoing mail host. But we do see all 6 servers, so they have all been added to the farm. So that's another good sign. And if we look at our web application service has been started, but for the most part, most of the others are stopped, which is good. Sandbox service is started properly, so that's good. Let's look at our web applications. Yeah, and we're using .local for this. Don't use .local. All right, so that's going to take a second to refresh. Let me load the other ones.
Yeah, and so the total script time over both sessions to basically take our logical architecture and implement it has taken approximately 40 minutes for both of those scripts to run. Obviously with a lot of waffle, but that's alongside it, that's the type of on reasonably low-end kit, effectively, in terms of the power of each individual host, we can rapidly provision out these farms, in less than an hour, with all of our settings, managed paths, cache accounts, etc., in a nice, repeatable fashion.
Right. So SP03 took 17 minutes, I think we said. This one took 23 minutes, so combined 40 minutes to provision all 6 servers. The reason SP03 took longer is because there are more service instances on there. Specifically, the user profile sync service takes a little while to get that one started. So there's a lot of just kind of waiting for him to go. And then there's a few things with search that take a little while to go. But that one has the bulk of the service instances running on it, and it's also where, as a result, we're creating the service applications initially, so it takes much longer. On the other servers, because we're not having to create most of those service applications, they already exist, it's really just about starting the service instance. It goes much quicker. So see, some of them are coming through already. So this is the team site that opened up okay. So this again was provisioned in the earlier session, but we couldn't show it because we didn't have that web application service started on SP03. We got our My Site provisioned and our intranet provisioned. And I don't want to bother logging into SQL Server, but I do want to show you our databases here. So if we look, another really nice thing, there's no GWIDs in our database name. So if you're got an environment that you configured through one of the wizards or whatever, you'll be familiar with the GWIDs in there, and I really hate that. So we have a nice, consistent naming convention for all of our databases. We can look and we know exactly what it goes to, what it's for, and there's no guessing about any kind of GWIDs and what they mean. So that's another huge benefit in my mind as far as the PowerShell stuff.
Great. So, success? The answer is yes. Thanks very much for sticking with it. And let's break for lunch, and we'll move on with some interesting stuff on SQL Server.
Oh, if anybody has any questions,